Hey friends, it's Laura with Laura B Floss Tube. Welcome or welcome back. I'm so glad you joined me today. We are going to be starting our Lori Holt Be Happy Quilt Sew Along. This is the first video in the series. We're going to be talking all about that hexie honeycomb border, and we're going to whip that up lickety-split. The first thing you want to do is look through your cutting guide and figure out what different dimensions you need for your background fabrics. We're going to need several to make that honeycomb border. The next thing you're going to have to think about is how many hexagons to trace, how many pieces of fabric to gather, and how to manage all of those pieces. So I'm going to give you a few spoilers. You're going to need 68 large hexagons and 31 small hexagons. Now, when you look in the cutting guide and look at that small hexagon, it's going to tell you to trace 35, but only 31 of them go into the border. The other 4 we're going to use later on for a different block. So you're also going to need several pieces for that border. And I did some math and I looked at it and tried to break it all down, and there are definitely different sizes and different length, different numbers of hexagons that go together to form that honeycomb border. It's not just one continuous piece. There's some spaces in between some of the pieces. So I will put up on the screen right here how many of each size you're going to need for that, just to give you a little heads up and just to make it easier for you so you don't have to do all of the hunting that I did. So as we talk through this, you're going to see that you're going to need 4 4.5-inch squares. Now I'm going to cut my background fabric at 5, not 4.5, because that way I can put my honeycomb piece on there and trim that down to 4.5. The other border pieces, I'm going to also cut all of those at 5 inches wide with the varying lengths, and I'm going to round up to the next inch. That's going to make sure that I have a little bit of leeway just in case when I applique those pieces down that my fabric could shrink just a little bit. That kind of happens sometimes with applique, so we're going to err on the side of caution and make all of those pieces just a little bit bigger. Now, like I said, I'm going to go 1/2 inch bigger, but please feel free to go even maybe 1 inch bigger, and then you will be able to trim those down to the exact sizes that you need. Now, as far as the clusters of honeycomb pieces in those borders, we're going to have clusters of 3, 5, 7, and even 8. So there's several different combinations that go into that border, and then we're also going to have those 4 singles. So if you look at your cutting guide and look at the picture of the quilt, you can kind of break it down and figure out which goes where. If you've matched up fabrics to the cutting guide and you're following that along religiously, then you'll have a little better idea of what's going where. Now, I actually had enough scraps, oh my goodness, that I actually was able to cut out 68 different fabrics for that honeycomb border. So I don't have to worry about any of the repeats. I just have to worry about spreading those different colorways out the way I like them in that border. So once you get all of your supplies together, so you need your background strips, your 4.5-inch squares for your large hexie, the 2.5-inch squares for your small hexies, all of your interfacing trace, then you'll be ready to head to your machine. Now that's where I'm at today. I've actually sewn up quite a few already, and I'm going to show you how I'm managing to get all of those sewn up on the machine today. All right, on my extension table here on my sewing machine, you're going to see that I have 1 piece of interfacing and I have 6 hexies that are on that. Now, when I traced my shapes, I traced them all in big rows across my interfacing, and then I decided that I could probably handle 6 at a time that would be joined together on my sewing machine, and it's actually worked out pretty well so far. Let me show you how I'm laying these out, so you can do it the same way if you want. Otherwise, you can obviously cut all of these apart into individual units and just chain piece them through your machine. Now, if you haven't done any of the Lori Holt applique before, then this may be something new for you. Now, my stitch length, I've reduced that down to 1.8 instead of a 2.4, which is standard on my machine. I am using a Juki DX7. I get asked that question all the time, so I try to remember to tell you. And I'm just going to use a straight stitch, and all these shapes are traced, so I'm just going to use this right underneath my needle. Start down the one side till I get to the point. Turning. And there we can have it. Now, you may have noticed that I did overlap my stitching on that first side. I sewed down the entire first side, and then I sewed on that entire first side to end it as well, and that just overlaps that stitching, so then I don't need to back stitch on these. I will just be able to keep going on without back stitching. Now, if you have not done one of the Lori Holt quilts before, I will mention that this is a little bit different of a process than other applique techniques. You are using the interfacing method, which means your fabric should be facing right side up. So you can look at your interfacing and say this is, you've traced basically on the wrong side of your fabric, and this would be the right side. So when I sew around my block, I actually have right sides together. And then we'll cut this interfacing later on, which I'll show you, and flip that piece out, and that will complete our applique shape before we sew it onto our background fabric. Now, if you haven't done any of the interfacing applique before, this is actually a great shape to start with because it's all straight lines. There's no curves. It's not like some of the flowers that we'll be progressing into later on in the sew along. When you get to that point, you just make your pivot and keep sewing to the next side. Now I am going to go ahead and sew a lot because I'm going to sew the first 3 sides that I sewed. I'm just going to keep on going around here just so I can travel over to jump over to the next shape. Now, if you wanted to cut your thread and move over, that would be perfectly fine. This is just what's working for me. And the interfacing is thin enough that you can see. Make sure you have your fabric underneath that shape and have, about 1/4 of an inch hanging out on each side because you are sewing directly on that line. So that is the shape the size of the shape that you're going to be getting. When we trim these out, we'll be trimming them and leaving about 1/4 of an inch. Sometimes I go a little shy of that. Again, I'm just going around a few extra sides just so I can travel and jump over to the last shape in this row. Like I said, if you want to cut your thread between them and just move over to the next shape, that's fine. Just make sure that you have overlapped your beginning and ending thread a little bit. I'm going to get around this shape and then I want to move you in closer to the last 2. Now there are a bunch of these to do and I do not have all of them done, but I'm going to show you the next step, which I'm just going to cut some out and flip a few out just so you can see how that process works. All right, so I'm just going to cut this shape right about 1/4 of an inch, maybe a little less than that. But when I get to these corners, I'm going to snip those off flat because we don't want any of that extra bulk in our seam allowance. So that's all there is to it, to cutting that shape out. And then I like to use my Fiskars needle pointed scissors to just cut that interfacing a little bit. Then we're going to flip that shape out. And this is where I'm going to grab my 2-point turner. It's a Clover product. Now a chopstick will work as well. I wouldn't use your scissors just because you might poke through them, kind of like I did right there. But that's okay, it'll be fine. And then here is my very first little honeycomb border piece that has been sewn, flipped, and turned out. Now I will press this before I actually applique it onto a background. But like I said, I have 68 big ones and 31 little ones to do, so I have a lot of sewing and a lot of flipping. I have all of my shapes sewn. They are not all turned. I'll do that a little bit as we go along, but I did want to turn enough of the shapes and get those into one of the border strips so you can see the process for that. So if you are a lot faster than me, then you can go ahead and get your honeycomb border together. So here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna do one of the 7 honeycomb piece strips, and I'm gonna assume this is probably going to be the one that I put in the top border of the quilt. Again, I'm going to put the different background fabrics that you need to cut right here as a little cheat sheet for you. So you go ahead and cut those out. Now I am cutting mine. The finished strips are like 4.5 by whatever the lengths are. They're varying. I'm cutting mine at 5, 5.25, 5.5, depending on the size scraps that I have. And then the length, I'm adding about an inch, 1.5 inches more to the length. That's just in case my applique draws that fabric in, and then after I get the shapes appliqued down, I will trim down those border pieces to the exact size that I need, and then my borders will go together flawlessly. And that's really going to help you out. Just keep that in mind with any of our applique that we do. You'll notice that Lori Holt has you cut those pieces, the background pieces, bigger than the finished size of the block, and it's just because, just in case, it draws in as you applique those pieces on top of that background fabric. All right, so like I said, I'm gonna do a 7-piece honeycomb border strip that I'm gonna assume is gonna go on the top border of my quilt. And so we're gonna head on over to the ironing board, and I'm gonna show you just pressing those shapes out, and then a couple little tricks on how to get those centered and working on your background piece. All right, so at the ironing board, you're gonna see I have my 7 little honeycomb pieces laid out up here, and I have my background piece right here. I've actually started to press it, and then I was like, oh wait, I wanna show this. So this piece I cut right around 5.5 by 24 inches long. My finished border piece is gonna be 4.5 by 22.5 inches long. So what I have done is I took this piece and I pressed it flat, and then I folded it in half, lengthways and widthways. And this is gonna give me a nice sharp line to line up all these little honeycomb pieces. Now, if you've watched my other videos, you know that I'm a fan of Quilters Select Free Fuse, and that's what I'm going to use to put these on there too. And that way it's going to allow me to go ahead and get those pieces onto the background piece and then get back to the sewing machine immediately to applique them down. Now, obviously you can do this different ways. If you prefer to use an applique glue like Sue Daly's applique glue, or I also like Mary Ellen's tacky glue. It works really well, and honestly Elmer's glue will work just as fine too. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look and say, okay, this is my centerpiece. So I'm going to take that honeycomb piece and I'm going to just put a little free fuse right here. I'm going to match that up right on these crossed press lines. I'm going to move you in a little closer so you can see that. Now the honeycomb pieces are going to go stack one next to another all the way down this row. So that's why I'm going to start in the center, because that way I know that's the center of my block. Now the other thing I'm going to do is going to go ahead and I'm going to iron this little honeycomb in half one direction, and that's going to match up my crosshairs, I guess, as you would say, to get that piece perfectly centered in the middle of this strip. I'm just going to give that a good little press, and the free fuse just takes a couple seconds to adhere, and then that should be stuck on. All right, now I'm gonna go ahead and put this little piece right in the center. And to be quite honest with you, I'm gonna eyeball this. You could definitely measure it out, and please feel free to do so if you would like to do that. But I'm just gonna eyeball it and keep going. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start one direction or the other and start building out my honeycomb border. So I'm just going to take my free fuse and go right along this line. And again, I'm going to put the little center pieces kind of up here, because I'm not going to put those on first. I'm going to put those on after the main honeycomb. And I'm just going to lay these out, matching up these sides of the hexies. And then I'll just press. And I'm going to press, you know, from the closest to the center out, just in case anything moves on me. I can kind of move it back. Give those a nice good press. And then just put a little bit of this free fuse in the middle. And again, I'm just gonna eyeball these. I don't necessarily have to make sure that they're perfect on each one of them. Just want them to be pretty close. And you know, again, if you want them perfect, then you obviously measure it out. I'm looking for more of a, I don't know, a vintage rustic vibe. So if they're not perfectly aligned, it's not gonna drive me crazy. All right, and now I'm just gonna do the other end of this strip, and again, just starting with the free fuse, going right on that line, and moving these 3 down so I know which order they go in. And again, just laying those out. Now for the background fabrics for these border pieces, I honestly just went through my scrap stash and just grabbed some predominantly white background fabrics. This was actually leftover 108 yardage on the back of one of the quilts that I've done. So as long as it's big enough and predominantly white, that's kind of where I was going with it. And then this little guy goes right in the middle of this. All right, now we are ready to head back to the sewing machine and applique these little shapes down. Just in case you were wondering, yes, I do have all of these little honeycomb pieces done. I do not have them all turned, but they are all ready to be turned. And some of them are slashed for the interfacing and some of them aren't, but I'm gonna set those to the side because we're gonna work on appliquing this border. Okay, so I have not been able to figure out a pattern of how I could sew all the way down all 7 and not have to cut my thread. So I can get 2 of them, but not all 7 of them. So if you figured that out, then you're doing better than me. But we're just going to work our way down the row. And if you have watched me do applique before, you know that I kind of go back and forth. Sometimes I use matching thread, and sometimes I use just the same color thread to applique all of my shapes down, no matter what color they are. I'm going to do kind of a combination on this quilt. I think in the middle, I'm going to probably match my threads, but on these borders, since there's so many different colors and so many little pieces to go on these honeycomb borders, I'm just going to use a really dark brown thread. And the color that I am using is a Dual Duty XP. Let's see, it is 8930. So if you want the exact same color thread, this is what you're looking for. I do use Dual Duty. It is an all-purpose thread. It is not 100% cotton. It's 100% polyester, actually. I'm fine with it. It's an economical option, and it comes in such a plethora of colors. And I've been able to, take fabric swatches to the store and match up all the fabrics to colors, and I'm really happy with it. I've gotten good results, and so if you are a die-hard only cotton for your quilts person, then obviously do not follow my lead. Do your own thing. But I know I have people ask me quite often what thread I'm using and how I'm doing that, and that's the answer. So we are going to start right here in the middle, I guess, of these 2 little hexies. And just for those of you who haven't seen me applique before, I am using the Juki DX7. I have it on the zigzag stitch with my clear foot, which has a little triangle in the middle. I set my stitch width to 1.8 and my stitch length to 0.9. The standard for the zigzag is 3.6 on width and 1.4 on length. So definitely reducing both of those things down quite a bit. This is the size and the style that I like. So, you have to kind of play around with that. If you have not appliqued before, play around with the different stitches on your machine and decide what you like. All right, so I'm going to start with a stop stitch and just applique down the first side. Now, when I get to that corner, I'm going to I want my needle on the outside. That's just, again, that's what I've found I like best with the zigzag stitch. What I love about this clear foot is that little triangle in the middle, just because I can run the little middle of the triangle right down the edge of my fabric, and I know that zigzag is going to go basically right on the edge of the shape. So it's a nice little feature. Now when I get to this intersection between the two little honeycomb pieces, or the hexies, I am going to just pivot, and I'm going to sew right down the middle of those, and basically I'm going to applique both of those shapes down at the same time. So I'm only going to have one stitching line across both of those shapes. We'll get to the top here, and we will go again. Again, between those two pieces, I'm going to go right down the center of them, so I'm appliquing both of those edges on at the same time. And when I get back here, I'm going to do my little stop stitch or stay stitch again and cut my thread, because that's really all I can do. So I am going to go again for the next two and continue down this row. I'm going to move you to the other side just because I feel like that angle might be a little better too. Give you a little variety that way. All right, we have these appliqued down. We're going to head back to the ironing board to press it out. So at this point, I'm going to turn it face down onto my ironing board, spray it down with a little best press, and just run this hot iron over it. Just pressing out any creases or any little gatherings that I might have just from it drawing in when I was appliquing. I've just found it's really a good idea to press these out nice and flat before you trim it down, just in case there's any little discrepancies. Now obviously I need to cut some of these strings on the back too before I put it together, but we can head on over to the cutting mat and trim this down to size. All right, so in the cutting guide there is an assembly page for the quilt. It's on page 4 actually in the cutting guide. And what I've done here is I've just kind of divided the quilt out, and I know where all of my honeycomb border pieces are going. So I know there's a 3715 and a 5173, and then I have notes in the corner that just tell me how big each one of those finished pieces of the border should be. So I know that my 7 honeycombs should be 4.5 by 22.5, and it's on a top and a bottom. They're both labeled right there. So I just need to cut this down to 4.5 by 22.5. And we will have the first piece of our honeycomb border completed. So when I lay my ruler onto the honeycomb border, I can see that my honeycomb pieces are 3.5 inches from point to point. And my strip is going to be 4.5 inches from side to side. So I know that I need 1/2 inch above and 1/2 inch below. So I can line my ruler up right on that 1/2 inch mark up on the top of these honeycombs and cut that off with my rotary cutter. And we'll have the first cut for our border completed. And then I'm just going to slide this ruler over to the 4.5 inch point. and cut the other side. Now it's 22.5 inches long, so let's see where that puts us. 22.5, if I move it to 3/4 on each end, that will put me right where it needs to be. That'll center it, because it looks like the honeycombs are 21 inches long, and this strip is supposed to be 22.5. So that means I have 1.5 inches extra. So I'm just gonna slide this down. I'm gonna slide this over, put a straight line on that top edge here, and put the 3/4 inch mark right on the edge of this honeycomb. Cut this end. Then I'm just gonna simply slide this down, line up 22.5, and cut this end. All right, so here is our first piece of border. Let's go on to the design wall so we can talk about some of the other tips and tricks that I can share with you for this border. Okay guys, so obviously this is not very much of the border that's completed, but we'll get there, it's fine. So this is one of the 2 segments of 7 honeycombs that I need for the border. As you saw, you know, I would say the most time you're gonna spend is sewing all these shapes onto your interfacing and then turning them out. Once you start putting the borders together, it's not going to take as much time as the rest of it did. So, you know, my plan for this sew along is to do some of the border each week. I'm not going to try to get it all done before we head into week 2 with the flag and pinwheels. I'm going to just do a little bit as I can. So I'm going to, like, you know, I sewed all my shapes under the interfacing. That was a good probably hour and a half to get, it's like 99 hexagons. So between the large and the small ones, you have 99 hexagons for this border. So I did that in one setting. It probably, like I said, probably hour and a half to get that done. The next thing I did was I cut them all out. So they're all stacked and ready for me to start cutting through that interfacing and then start turning them out. Now this is something that I can do while I'm watching TV or just, you know, some spare time that I'm just like, I can turn a few hexies out. So after I get all of them turned out, I'm probably gonna go ahead and press all of them and then divide them by color. So I'll get all my colors divided into the different groups, and then I can start looking at that border and getting my color disbursement evenly around the quilt. For this one, I honestly just grabbed 7 hexies that I knew were different colors and grabbed the centers, and it's going to be fine because, like I said, I have a lot more hexies in this quilt to do. So doing this one border segment before I lay out the entire border isn't going to concern me at all. Yeah, so that's what I would suggest. I would suggest trying to get this honeycomb border in stages completed as we go along with the other blocks in the sew along. The first week that or the second week, I guess, the second week that we're doing next week is the flag and the pinwheels. I hope you join me for that. Those pinwheels are piece blocks, so no applique for that. The flag has a star on it, and that's the only applique you're doing for it. So make sure you're using Lori's blog post because she gives lots of other tips and tricks. That's where I got all the dimensions for my border pieces. I did not go hunting through the cutting guide for that. I just decided I'll go to the blog post and she'll tell me which sizes are which. And so I, you know, made a list of those, which I shared with you earlier in the video, and it kind of got all my backgrounds cut out. I have those divided into piles, so I know that I have, you know, 2 for the 8s and 1 for the 7 and 2, you know, as they go on, they're all labeled and ready. So when I get to the point where I can get more hexies onto those border pieces, I have my background pieces cut for that. So I would just say, you know, look and see what you can do in, you know, 10 or 15 minutes and get that little bit done. And you know, I personally would not try to take on the entire honeycomb border in one setting because I'd get bored and it'd be very overwhelming. So like I said, I'm going to do bits and pieces as we go along with the sew along, just, you know, little things that I can do And again, you know, if you want to match your colors to your fabrics, please feel free to do that. I just decided for the honeycomb border, I'm just going to give it a nice dark brown, and I think it looks good. I mean, I think it gives it a little contrast and a really good fun look. So yeah, so this is the first week. This is what we're doing, but like I said, we're not going to try to get it all done this first week. We're going to get started on our honeycomb border. So don't think that you have to have all of these done this first week. Don't stress yourself out like this. But I'm so glad that you joined me for the Be Happy Quilt Sew Along. The other thing that I didn't get together this week is that I have a puzzle for the Be Happy Quilt that I'm also going to be putting together as we're sewing along. And so I may, you know, do some puzzle piecing while I am giving some tips and tricks into videos for you guys. So with all of that being said, I'm just going to wrap up this first video in the Be Happy Quilt Sew Along by saying I hope you're finding joy in all that you do. Carve out some time for craft and creating, and make sure you can always say it's been happy stitching.